Welcome here, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the last installment of our awesome, safe Monarchs webinar series. It's been an incredible year. There have been some awesome topics, and everything gets recorded and put up on the YouTube channel. I will say that the number of views continue to go up on the videos that we've had, which is fantastic because we get a lot of great feedback from every one of these sessions. But in addition to that, they live on and are beneficial, and due to the cyclical nature of biology, some of the topics that are seasonal will come back around in the coming year and will be useful again. So I'm super excited for today's topic. It's a kind of a combo of a couple of topics that we meant to hit earlier in the year, and for various reasons we had to cancel, or there was hurricanes and just life got in the way. So we've done a merger of topics, and now we have this super duper awesome combo topic, which is overwintering monarch butterflies and how you can prepare for the next what you can do in the off season to prepare for the upcoming season, whether that's field work or citizen science or guest interactions, you name it. So once again, we're going to kick it off to the one and only Katie Lynn Bunny from the Monarch joint venture, and she's going to take us on this journey. And afterwards, we will have time for facilitated discussion, as always. So take it away, Katie Lynn. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Zach. And hello, everybody. I know I can't see you, but I can see your names. It's good to see some familiar names again. You should be able to see my screen now. Oh, good. I can see that it's up there. Wonderful. So as Zach said, this is kind of a combination topics to make up for some of the webinars that we had to either postpone or cancel earlier this year. I'll share some resources, some information. Some of this might be review for a lot of you. So if it is, feel free to learn more from it. Otherwise, wait for the next thing. It might not be a review, or may offer some additional context for some things that you might already know. If you do have questions about anything, go ahead and put those in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll answer them at the end. And as always, we're all available for questions post-webinar through email or whatever venue you feel like you want to reach out to us. Feel free to do that too. So today we're going to focus on some of the finer details of the migration. I know we've talked about the migration already, so I'm going to recap some of that just so that we're all freshly minded. I know we just went through the fall migration. Monarchs have arrived in their overwintering sites. Counting in the West has already occurred. If you haven't been following the Xerces Society's Thanksgiving count numbers, they haven't released the official numbers, so this might change, but so far things are looking really awesome in California. 300,000 monarchs have been counted so far, which is fantastic. It's so exciting. But anyway, so the migration is completed for the fall. There might be a few straggling monarchs flying through in the West, but for the most part, they've all reached their overwintering sites. The fall migration begins in August at the higher latitudes, and then moves on southward as the fall progresses. And then by November, monarchs have reached their overwintering sites and have started settling in for the winter. Monarchs spend the complete winter in their overwintering sites. In Mexico, that's through March. In California, that's through parts of February. And then they begin the other half of their migration cycle. So the monarchs that leave for the migration in the fall start the migration again in the spring, but they don't get back to where they started. They lay their offspring in either like the Central Valley area and other parts of California if they're Western monarchs, and then parts of Northern Mexico, Southern United States if they are Eastern monarchs, and then their offspring complete the migration northward. That can take 1 generation, 2 generations. It kind of depends on weather and different conditions and things like that. And then during the summer months, from about June through August in the north, we have, well, maybe even May, I guess, depending on where you are latitudinally. The monarchs will be breeding, and there will be multiple generations of monarchs breeding throughout the summer months. So there can be anywhere between 2 and 3, depending on temperature and conditions and things like that. So in total, it can take 4 to 5 generations to do a complete annual cycle of the migration. And I'll recap this again with a different map, but I wanted to talk, which we haven't talked about yet, I don't think, a little bit about why, like, what are the cues that monarchs receive to trigger migration. And they're the same in each season, in late summer and then in the springtime, but opposite. So those are day and night temperature fluctuations. So in the fall, when the temperature gets cooler at night, but the daytime temperatures are still warm. And then in the opposite in the spring, when the daytime temperature starts increasing the nighttime temperature starts increasing closer to what the daytime temperature is. The second cue that they receive are day length. So in the fall, that's decreasing day length, and in the spring, that's increasing day length. This one is more prevalent in the fall, the age of the milkweed. So the age of the milkweed that monarch caterpillars are eating in the fall or late summer can be one of the cues that they receive to initiate reproductive diapause and thus migration. So if they're eating green, fresh milkweed, it's possible they may not receive all of the cues that they need. This is still a area of the migration that's being studied, and how that the age of the milkweed and even the presence of milkweed can affect migration. We know that the presence of green milkweed, particularly tropical milkweed, can pull monarchs that are already in diapause on their way to migrating to their overwintering sites. If they see green milkweed, they can be pulled out of diapause and start breeding again. So we know that age or presence of milkweed does affect their migration. And then finally, the angle of the sun. So as the sun gets lower in the sky in the fall or higher in the sky in the spring, that's another cue for monarchs to migrate either north or south, depending on which season they're at. So all of these things work together. Not one of these works on its own, but the day length in particular is one of the ones that right now we think it has the greatest influence on whether or not monarchs migrate, which is why we say if you're going to be raising monarchs for citizen science, you should be doing it in as many natural conditions as possible. So outside, if you can, do it safely, where they're being exposed to the day length and the day-night temperature fluctuations. So to recap, they're receiving all of those cues in the fall. That final migration, or that final generation of the fall, migrates south or southwest to California starting in August, and then September and October. They spend November through March or February in their overwintering sites. And then in the spring, they migrate northward, lay their eggs along the way. Those adults that were overwintering die. They've fulfilled their life's purpose by creating a new generation. And that new generation grows up to adult stage and then continues the migration northward, essentially kind of following the milkweed as it emerges in the springtime. In their northern ranges, their breeding ranges, there will be 2 to 3 generations again of breeding monarchs, and that final generation starts the process all over again in the fall. So as a reminder, monarchs that spend the winter on the coast of California or in central Mexico have never been there before. They'll never see it again, and yet still finding the same places year after year, and so far without fail, which is one of the great mysteries, how they find those places. How do they know where to go? We don't really know how they navigate. We know that they use some combination of receptors in their antennae and their eyes to orient themselves north and south. But there are still really great mysteries that people could solve on how monarchs migrate and navigate during their migration. Okay, so while monarchs are overwintering, there's not a whole lot of action happening. Slightly more possibly in California. There are possibly more nectar sources available to them depending on where they are, but in general, they're just kind of sitting there waiting for conditions to be right again for reproducing in the spring. And as a reminder, monarchs that migrate live longer than the monarchs that are breeding throughout the summer, because they delay breeding in order to live longer. If you're parents, you understand that reproducing is an energy taxing process, and raising young, even though monarchs don't really raise their young, it takes a lot of energy to mate and lay hundreds of eggs. So by delaying that, they're prolonging their life. They're in a state of reproductive diapause. And most insects go through some stage of diapause or some state of diapause at different stages. Some do it as larvae, some do it as pupae, some, like monarchs, do it as adults. And it's essentially a way to wait until conditions are more favorable for breeding. And for monarchs, that's when it's warm and there's milkweed around. And so they're moving to these areas that are not only different from their, geographically different from their breeding areas, but they're also very different temperature wise. They're a lot cooler, they're more protected, and having those cooler, like Goldilocks type temperatures where they're not too hot, not too cold, and then also being in a state of diapause helps them prolong their life to up to 9 months. Whereas breeding monarchs usually live on average about 4 weeks. So that could be, that's 9 times their typical lifespan. So while they're overwintering either in the forest of central Mexico, up in the Oyamel fir trees, or along the coast of California, they're really just huddled together, conserving heat, trapping whatever warmth they can between their bodies. They might shiver a little bit on sunny, warmer days, calm days. They might come off the trees and fly around. As spring approaches and more nectar becomes available, they'll leave and look for more nectar sources. They will look for water, particularly in Mexico. They'll look for streams and puddles and things like that for them to meet their water needs. If they need that, they'll seek it out. But otherwise, this is kind of what they look like all winter long. They're just kind of waiting there. And I included some images here of them huddling on the ground because the ground is muddy. They're seeking out water, and then on a sunny, warm day near the end of the winter, flying up above the trees looking for warmth, water, nectar, possibly even a mate. They do start mating as they leave the overwintering sites. So we've talked about estimating population too, but I wanted to refresh everybody's memories that this happens in the winter because conveniently monarchs are all in the same place or 2 separate places. So in Mexico, monarchs are counted by how much space that they take up by measuring, they'll go around on foot and figure out what the borders are of the colony, and then how much space that is in what the area is of that shape in hectares, which gives us graphs like this. This is the most current graph. 2.84 hectares were counted in the winter of 2021-2022. The Eastern monarch population numbers are usually released in March. They were a little bit later this past year because of some things that were happening in Mexico. So we'll look to see the official count coming from World Wildlife Fund Mexico in the springtime. And then there are technically two official counts for monarchs. There's one around Thanksgiving, monarchs in the West. There's the Western monarch Thanksgiving count and Western monarch New Year's count. So the New Year's count is a way to measure how change happens over the course of the winter. So monarchs are counted first in Thanksgiving, and that is our official population number. And then there's a second count that happens around New Year's to see how things have changed. The Thanksgiving count has wrapped up. They're still compiling data, so I don't have 2022 data yet. But 2021, good news again, about 250,000 monarchs counted in the West. And monarchs in the West are counted differently. They're not measured by area. They're actually estimated by individuals. So they go around and estimate how many monarchs are in clusters at each of the overwintering sites, and then add all of those numbers up to get graphs like this. And for California, we also keep track of, or Xerces also keeps track of the number of sites monitored so that we can see how many different sites monarchs are spread out across the coast of California. So the Western monarch numbers are usually officially released in January. We've heard from Xerces that they're still compiling the data, and they'll release them when they're complete in January. But it's looking good. Like I said, they've already counted 300,000 monarchs plus, which is more than it's been since 2000, the year 2000. I'm so excited for California right now. Okay, so that's what monarchs are doing in the winter. Again, it's not a whole lot. The cues that they receive to migrate in the spring pull them out of diapause. So longer days, warmer nights, higher sun in the sky, and then the presence of milkweed in some cases will also pull them out of diapause. And those are the cues to start breeding and then moving northwards again. And this migration has been happening for thousands of years. It's built into the mythology and the beliefs of the people around those areas. And it's a really important part of the cultures of central Mexico and California. I mean, people in California, there's whole towns that center around the life of the monarch butterfly. So it would be a real shame to see something as spectacular as the monarch migration disappear. And that's why we're all here together, to make sure that doesn't happen. And there are things that we can do for monarchs in the winter when they're not necessarily present in their area, or even when they are. And really, it's about reframing how you think about engaging with monarchs and engaging in different ways. So where I am in Minnesota, there's about 5 inches of snow on the ground right now. It's 21 degrees. I'm not going to be planting habitat in the winter here in Minnesota. It's just not possible. The ground is frozen. The plants will die. And most of them are dormant anyway. Now, that's not true for other parts of the country. In other parts, you can plant habitat, or at least plan for it. So we've talked about some of the basic needs and principles of planting for pollinators, and those are a continuous bloom, something blooming throughout the entire growing season, diversity of plants, so not all milkweed, not all liatris. You want to have a variety. Milkweed only blooms for a few weeks, and you're also thinking about nectar sources. It's key also to think about native plants. So native plants that are both host plants for monarchs and other types of butterflies, but also nectar sources. And that's, again, where the diversity plays in. And to have a more holistic look at your pollinator habitat, you also want to be thinking about nesting sites for native bees. And that includes stems, that includes bare ground, that includes brush piles, leaf piles, things like that. And like I said, depending on where you are, either in the fall or early spring, and maybe even the winter, depending on where you are, those times might be really great times to start planting, or at least think about what you're going to plant and make plans for spring. I don't know about all of you, but every year spring sneaks up on me, despite the fact that I work with a very ephemeral insect. I know spring is coming, but May comes around and I haven't put a single thought into my habitat, and then I'm just kind of piecemealing things together on what I'm going to add. And I know my habitat would benefit a lot more if I actually put some forethought into it early on, like now. Maybe I'll do that this afternoon. So some specific geographic considerations to account for in the winter. If you are in the West, particularly California, you want to make sure that you're thinking about your proximity for overwintering sites. Right now, it is not recommended to plant milkweed within 5 miles of an overwintering site, and you should focus your planting and habitat efforts on nectar sources instead. If you look at the Xerces Society's websites, they've got resources for how to know where it's okay to plant milkweed. But in general, if you look at like historic range maps of where milkweeds are native, they're dormant this time of year for most types of milkweed in parts of California. So keep an eye on that. And instead focus on nectar sources, because even if monarchs aren't using them, other pollinators are as well, and more diversity is better. Having more types of insects visiting more types of flowers will keep your habitat resilient from disease and pests and things like that. For everyone, you want to think about when is the best time to prepare, to plant, etc. For those of us in the north, generally, as long as we get our plants in the ground before it freezes, they'll be fine if they're native. For everywhere else where you don't have hard freezes, you want to think about water availability, and whether or not the plants can withstand shipping to your space if they need to be, things like that. Just as another reminder, for milkweed specifically, there are over 100 species of milkweed that are native to North America, and you can look for what's native to your region in native plant guides. I've put a few up here that I've used and recommended in the past. Check with local nurseries if you're looking for resources on how to talk to native nurseries about why it's important to grow and sell native milkweeds, why it's important to avoid neonicotinoids. MJB has resources for that on our website, and many of our partners like the Xerces Society do as well. And reminder to avoid tropical milkweed. It's not native and perpetuates disease and winter breeding. If you're looking for an example of a zoo or aquarium that has worked with eradicating tropical milkweed on their site, Zoo Miami has a really great page on their website on how they did that, and you can learn more about that from their website too. And then also watch for, when you're thinking about planting, whether it's milkweed or not, watch for pesticides like neonicotinoids and how they're being marketed towards you. Something like this with neonics markets it as beneficial and good because it'll keep all these pests. But the thing to keep in mind with pollinator habitat is that it's meant to be eaten by insects. And neonicotinoids are not targeted towards one specific group of insects. They harm all insects that ingest them. So just keep that in mind to watch out for things and not to be fooled by what looks like beneficial marketing. Some other ways to engage. I know a lot of people think of doing, community science programs in the summer when monarchs are present in their area, but there are ways, if you have monarchs in your area, or even if you don't, to still engage with those programs. So again, there's timing considerations, and not all of them are possible to participate in during the winter everywhere, but there are still some really great opportunities for engagement with several of them. And I'll talk about some of that here. So you've probably seen a lot of these logos before. So if monarchs are present in your area in the winter, whether you're in the West or the Gulf Coast, anywhere. So if they're present in your area and it's legal to handle them, which is not the case in California. So if it's legal to handle them, you could participate in Project Monarch Health, testing them for OE, rearing monarchs for the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project to estimate survival and parasitism rates. If monarchs are present in your area, there are other programs that you can participate in that don't require handling, just reporting sightings to programs like the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, iNaturalist, Journey North, or you could do more regular monitoring for the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. And if you're in California and want to get involved with the Xerces Society's Western Monarch Count, which happens again Thanksgiving and New Year's, you can be trained by an expert volunteer to participate in those. And to learn more about that, you can visit the Xerces website, the Western Monarch Hunt website. And I will send all of these links to Zach to send out to everybody too. iNaturalist is a very general program, but it's being used more and more by monarch researchers to learn more about where and when monarchs are present. And then in addition to that, the National Phenology Network, you could also track milkweed. If you don't have monarchs in your area, you can also look at just milkweed and when it's present and what the different phenophases are. Is it blooming? Is it gone to seed? Things like that. So the National Phenology Network is a good program for that. Other ways to engage, which I think are things that we're all adept at doing, being conservation organizations, is connecting and sharing. This is something we can always do whether monarchs are present or not. And especially when they're not present, connecting and sharing information about them keeps them in people's minds when they're not visibly reminded of them. That obviously involves sharing what people can do to help monarchs, just as we described, but it's also, winter is also a good time to think about advocacy. And advocacy can happen at many different levels. These are different types of community groups that can be really great places to advocate for monarchs and other pollinators on a small scale. And they can especially be a really great place for students or families to get started if they're not sure where a good starting place is. So at home, if you have children, your kids bring home things from school all the time and say, we should be doing this. As a child of the 90s, I was responsible for making sure my family recycled and turned off the water and all the lights, because that's what I was told was important for our planet at the time. Families can get involved at places of worship, libraries, parks, things like that. These are all areas that are very familiar to the people that frequent them as part of their community. And they already have that sense of community and wanting to do things together in most cases. So there's a lot of really great potential for behavior change here. Slightly more difficult, if people are up for the challenge, is helping to shift or change city ordinances or HOA regulations, homeowners associations. These are another way to make a big difference really close to home. On a slightly larger scale, depending on the HOA and the city. There can still be a sense of community in these places, but it can sometimes be challenging, depending on the size of the city, receptiveness of the people involved. And I've heard many stories from both of these types of situations on how hard it can be to change. But every HOA is different, and the best way to actually make that change happen is continued conversations and sometimes grueling meetings. But I've also heard several hopeful stories of people that did make change or at least compromise. One example is an HOA that said, no weeds, which obviously includes milkweed, but they were able to change the HOA regulation to nothing in the front yard, but planting whatever you want in the backyard is fine. Either way, it takes a little bit more time and effort to do things like these, and can sometimes feel like you're up against a brick wall, but with time and perseverance and, again, effort, these can be really great places to make change, and make change on such a large scale that it's affecting more than just your immediate circle of community, but also, sometimes your whole city or your whole neighborhood. If you are involved in voting or politics or anything like that, you might know all this, but just some tips for yourself or things you can share if you want. These are particularly helpful tips for government advocacy. So if you don't already know, you can find out who your elected officials are. USA.gov is a good place to start, and you can call and write their office and let them know what your thoughts are on different issues. And then on the right in the yellow box are some tips for how to do that. The biggest one is to keep it short and to the point. There are lots of places online that you can find templates for a phone call or written communication. And if there's a big issue, like there's some acts coming through Congress right now on pollinators, you can go to an advocacy website like the National Wildlife Federation. They have templates on there, and in some cases even just like buttons to say contact my representative, and then it gives you a form letter, it sends it for you, you put in your email address so that your email gets the response. So they make it really easy. But if you're doing it on your own, you want to remember to introduce yourself and say that you're a constituent and where you live and all that kind of stuff, so they can verify that. You can state why you're contacting them, mention, if there is one, a specific bill by name and number whenever possible. Let them know why the issue is important to you, include facts and resources when you have them. And you can also include a specific action that you want taken, like I want this bill supported or something, whatever's relevant to that area. It's also important to be courteous and respectful and thank them for their time. That's just politeness in politics, right? It's really easy to get caught up in the emotions of something. So if you feel yourself feeling really heated about something and you want to contact your representative, sleep on it, cool down a little bit, and be nice and courteous to them. They are elected officials, and this is their job. And none of us like to be yelled at all day at our jobs. So let's be nice about the things that we want to see change. Well, that was a quick 30 minutes of what we can cover. So we can take some time for questions. I see one in the Q&A right now from Cassandra. They say, my zoo is doing some winter messaging on Monarchs as part of a series, and we're discussing our outplanting projects for pollinator gardens. Is it wiser to focus on messaging about native nectar plants at this time of year and speak less on milkweed? That's a great question. And it depends. So I think where you are in the desert, there are evergreen desert species of milkweed. So you could talk about native milkweeds. And I do think it's important to at least mention milkweeds and let people know wherever you are in, whether you're in the desert or not, when is a good time to start thinking about planting native plants, including milkweed, and where they can go to find it, so that when the appropriate time comes, they're ready for it, especially if you're not also doing another campaign later at the same time that is an appropriate time. So like if you're doing a campaign on Monarchs now, and you put all of your emphasis on native nectar plants and none on milkweed, then the milkweed message gets missed completely when the time is appropriate for it. So I would still include it. The only time I wouldn't necessarily include importance of milkweed is if you are specifically located within that 5-mile radius of an overwintering site in California. And that's just because right now, based on what we know already, it's not evident that there are a lot of native milkweeds that are green and growing that time of year. There might be some, but it's not widespread. And monarchs will still, in that area, will still need nectar sources, and having those nectar sources can help ensure their survival through the winter. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, Cassandra, but feel free to follow up, anyone, if you have more questions on that.
Fantastic. That was excellent, Katie Lynn. Thank you so
Quick and
much.
dirty.
Yeah, if there are other questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A, and we can answer them there. Unless other questions come in, I have a couple. One of the things that jumps into my mind when I see the figures of overwintering monarchs over time, and you see, record lows, and then thankfully, I think we're all, as ecstatic as you are to see, the California numbers at now, over 20-year highs, which is just fantastic news. How do the populations bounce back in such a way? Is there concern that they have gone through a massive genetic bottleneck? Were they somehow not counted in those previous years? Just do we have a sense for what's been going on and how we can see such radical fluctuation?
That's an excellent question. And my answer is a little bit wishy-washy because we don't fully know. We know that we know what the numbers are saying, that there are this many monarchs in this particular year. But as we look at historical data, we're also looking at, there are people looking at like what the conditions were those years, what were the weather patterns, what other sort of stochastic events that were happening. So like if we go back and look at the winter season for monarchs in Mexico, we can go back and look at historical data and say, oh yeah, winter of 2000, 2001, there was a really bad winter storm. And that's why we were seeing fewer monarchs that year. And there was a really bad winter storm that year. And so we can look at data like that. But in the case of California, and actually we can send this link out, but the Xerces Society put out a really good blog called The Bounciness of Butterflies. And they put that out last winter when the 2021 numbers were released, because it was like, whoa, we went from fewer than 2,000 to over 200,000. How did that happen? And in that case, we might not know the particulars of why that increased so much for several more years yet until we can gather more data. But in general, monarchs and most organisms that have that lay a lot of eggs have the potential to grow in population really quickly when conditions are just right. And it's possible that that's one of the reasons that they increased so much from 2020 to 2021. It's also possible that not all of the monarchs migrated in 2021 or in 2020, and then more of them did in 2021 because conditions were different. We just don't know those answers yet. And to a different extent, the same is true for Eastern monarchs. We can look back at a year and say, oh yeah, they had a really cool spring, so they probably did better that year. But then they went through a drought in September and there were no nectar sources in Texas, right? So there's a lot more dynamic things at play in when you're looking at population modeling that is really hard to predict because you don't know what's going to happen. But it's also challenging to look backwards because you need to know exactly what to look at to know the reasons behind things. I had to answer your question about like a genetic bottleneck. I haven't heard anyone talk about that. That doesn't mean the conversation hasn't been happening. It just means I wasn't aware of it. But that would be a good question for MJV's science team, and I can ask that question if we want. I'm going to write that down because now I'm curious too. I'm sure someone has brought it up, but I don't know enough about population genetics to know at what point that bottleneck would happen with an insect. Writing that down. Okay. Thank you. Good question, Zach.
No worries. If we don't get another, I have more questions. I could keep asking questions.
Coming.
Yeah. So, I always, when talking about monarch populations, it's always these figures that pop into my brain as we're talking about them. And when we talk about how their populations are decreasing over time, this is clearly what I think that we're all referring to.
Mhm.
Have there been estimates to go back? Obviously we don't have direct count numbers, but prior to 1993, do we have estimates of historic averages? And have butterflies are bouncy, but have they always been so bouncy? Do we have a sense for how
Yeah.
long this trend has been going?
I don't think we have a sense for that particular thing, but we have historical anecdotal stories. Like, I believe some from California, they were estimating that there were 5 million monarchs overwintering in California at one point. There was a paper by Pleasance and Oberhauser, I believe it was 2012, that looked at monarchs in agricultural areas and the effects that things like glyphosate ready corn and things like that, and BT ready corn and soybeans have had on the population. And that paper estimated that historically that somewhere, at least within the agricultural era, up until the late 90s, that somewhere between 50 to 80% of monarchs overwintering in Mexico came from corn and soybean fields based on historical like data and estimates and things like that. But again, that's not getting at exact numbers. That's an estimate. And that estimate is tied to specifically the adoption of glyphosate and BT ready corn and soybeans, and how much the presence of milkweed has decreased since the adoption of those practices. And that is, I'm going to add that to my list of things to send Zach, that citation.
Thank you.
Just if you're curious. I mean, it
Yeah.
was 10 years ago now, but it's still relevant data.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're writing that down, Trent from Santa Barbara Zoo writes that, not a question so much, but there is a monarch genomic study going on by Dr. Chris Funk at Colorado State and Colorado
Yeah.
Department of Fish and Wildlife.
I think I've heard of that one. I've heard my coworkers talk about it. Okay. I'm writing down other things I need to send you, Zach. But
Love it. Yeah, send it all. Beautiful. Yeah, your comment about the brick wall of HOAs is something that I feel all the way to, like the core of my being.
Apparently, though, somebody told me about a law in Florida that allows for native habitat, I think, which is a loophole to get around some of those HOA regulations that you might come up against. So that's a tip for everybody. If you're coming up against brick walls like that, look at your state regulations and see if there's a loophole that allows you to plant for native pollinator, or like native habitat in general. And then you could say, hey, HOA, by saying we can't do this, you're actually in violation of this whatever code that the state has issued. So I have to do this now.
That is a hot tip.
Yeah.
I feel that it would be so beneficial, to have, more resources to approaching HOAs and trying to get movement there. I feel like there are so many, enthusiastic gardeners that want to make a difference, and many of us feel like our hands are tied a bit there. But maybe not. Maybe I can go to fight with my HOA.
I have that one bookmarked. Let me see if I can find it.
Well, as Katie Lynn is looking for that, I'm just going to say that it looks like our participants are starting to drop off a little bit, and it doesn't seem like we have more questions coming in. If you have another question, please ask it now, and there should be time to address it. Let's see. Rick from Tulsa says, I've seen a lot of fall breeding in Oklahoma prior to the overwintering migration coming through in September. Lots of folks ask, are they making it to Mexico? I respond that they are resident monarchs, but there's some evidence possibly of another generation. I also have lots.
That's a good question. So there is evidence that there's some what we call 5th generation breeding. So monarchs that were born further north than Oklahoma, migrate south, but encounter milkweed and then breed. And then those breeding monarchs would not make it to Mexico, but their offspring would.
Great. Fantastic. Also, Rick says, I have lots of experience with HOA and city governments. I can help direct folks through the journey of success. Just contact me. Rick, are you kidding me?
That's awesome. Thank you, Rick.
That is awesome. Yeah, I will certainly reach out. And if you don't mind being a resource that we could send out in the summary of this, I don't know if you want to put yourself quite out that far, but if you do, I think this would be a really valuable resource for many, many people. It's wonderful to have, somebody who's gone through that journey and could be a resource. That would be wonderful. Love it. Thank you. Well, cool. Thank you so much, Katie Lynn, for all of your knowledge and expertise as always. Thank you to everybody who came here today and joined us in the last Safe Monarch webinar series of the season. We'll see what we have next year, and I'm very excited to say that we are still working on hiring our Safe Monarch coordinator, and that person will be able to help us do all sorts of activities and outreach and coordination like this and much more. So we're very excited to bring somebody on next year and really start to do more. Will this webinar be posted to your YouTube page? Yes, it will. So after this, I'm going to accumulate the various links and resources, put everything together in an email, and I will send it out. So yeah, absolutely, it will be shared out. And all of the previous videos are there and available. I'll send a link out to all of them as well, so that can all be accessed. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you so much, Katie Lynn. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody else who joined us today.
Yeah, as always, reach out with questions if you have them. We're around. Thanks, everybody.